Jerusalem, Israel. This is Lowell Joseph Gallen, founder of the Root and Branch Association Limited, established in 1981 in New York State. I would like to welcome our viewers and listeners and our live Zoom studio audience to this evening's program in our Root and Branch Association Limited English Language Conference and Lecture Series, broadcasting from Jerusalem, Israel. And now I have to add two special announcements, which I won't have an opportunity to do for the next 25 years. We were celebrating up until last Wednesday's program, our first quarter century, our first 25 years from January 1995 until December 30th, last Wednesday. And today is our first program for the year 2021 and our first program for our second quarter century. When it will end, if we'll still be here, that's another question, but we've begun it. I won't be able to make that comment for 25 years, assuming I'm still here. And so there's another special announcement, but I'll leave that for a minute. Today is Monday, January 4th, 2021 in the Gregorian calendar. Happy Gregorian New Year to everyone. And it is let me check, the 21st day of Tevet, 5781 in the Hebrew calendar. We are broadcasting from the land of Israel, city of God, Jerusalem. Our speaker for this evening's program is Dr. Alal Eran, who will speak about dissecting the autism spectrum. And here's another special comment I wouldn't usually have an opportunity to make, which is that it's a program of great interest to me because I actually was formally diagnosed with high functioning autism / Asperger's. They didn't use that term by the time I got there, by the Keshet Institute at Tel HaShomer Hospital in Ramat Gan, Israel. On June 30th, actually, 2015, I got the diagnoses in the mail. The whole question of why did you wait to, 58 then? Till then, why not early? That's a whole nother question. So this is a special program for me because I'm the subject of the program in part. And now I would like to welcome our program chair, Dr. Les Glassman, who will introduce Dr. Eran. Les, it's all yours.
Okay, Lal, thank you so much. And to all our viewers and listeners, just want to wish you all a happy, healthy, and most important, a safe new year. Let this be a year full of mazel and bracha, and may we all, please God, be safe, and let this be hopefully a better year than the previous one. But it gives me great honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Ali Eran. So just a very brief bio, because we could spend a long time discussing your incredible achievements. But you were born, Sabra, born in Kibbutz Hamapil near Hadera, here in Israel, and you did your undergraduate studies at Ben Gurion University. So I have a personal affiliation with Ben Gurion because my eldest daughter, she chose, out of all the universities in Israel to go to, she chose to go to Ben Gurion, and she really loved it. And she was so excited to go. It was such a wonderful environment. She made very good friends, and the whole department that she was in, she just was very happy that she chose Ben Gurion. So our family has a very close affiliation to Ben Gurion University. Anyway, from Ben Gurion, you then went on, and this is absolutely unbelievable, you did a PhD at Harvard together with MIT, as I understand it, in integrating computer science and medicine, how to solve medical issues and medical problems using computer science, which is so topical for today and so important. And we just see how the relationship between the two is so integrated and it's so vital. And this is the future. Yeah, this is the actual future. Anyway, you were a Harvard Medical School lecturer of pediatrics at Boston Children's Hospital, and you've been associated with Ben Gurion University in the National Autism Research Center of Israel, which is also affiliated with the Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. And last year, it's so hard to say last year, but only a few months ago, you published, it's a groundbreaking article and work in the very prestigious Nature Medicine, together from the Life Science Department of Ben Gurion University, along with the American colleagues. An incredible article and in this most prestigious journal, where your research identified a subtype of autism arising from a cluster of genes that regulates cholesterol, metabolism, and brain development. And I think this is something not only groundbreaking, but it's such an honor and a privilege to have a Sabra, an Israeli, who's in the forefront of such research. And please God, one day we'll be able to say that you'll be presented with the Nobel Prize, because you know the work that you're doing affects so many people, and it's so important. And I can't wait to hear your lecture tonight, you know, your presentation. So without any further ado, it is a great honor and a privilege to introduce you, Dr. Eran.
Thanks so much. And it's an honor to be here. I'm so happy I can tell you all about this study. And can I start sharing my screen now? Is it okay? Not yet.
You could share your screen and Lowell just has to allow it.
Lowell, you're muted.
Yeah, yes, that should be. Let's see. Oh, yes. It's. Oh, I thought that's automatic. Okay. Yes, everyone can share the screen.
Thanks. Okay. Are you ready?
Ready. We're very
Ready
excited
and
for your talk.
Okay. And please ask me any questions. I already know this study. I'd like to answer your questions. So I would like to start with an introduction of the autism spectrum. And what you're seeing here are some videos of famous individuals on the spectrum, such as Sheldon, from The Big Bang Theory, or Rain Man, if you remember that excellent movie from the 80s. And here we have Temple Grandin, which is not really a fictional character, but actually a female with autism spectrum disorder. That her story was later filmed by HBO. And on the bottom, we have a few videos of real children on the autism spectrum. And what identifies all of these individuals and the reason for their diagnosis is because of only two symptoms. One is reduced social and communication abilities, and the second is increased repetitive and stereotypical behaviors. And it's a big problem that we have a disorder that's defined only based on symptoms, because that leads to a great heterogeneity. We don't understand the different causes, so we integrate many different neurodevelopmental disorders into one umbrella term of autism spectrum disorders. And we have individuals that are, you know, high functioning and require very little support. They tend to be very intelligent, but still have some social and communication problems. For example, like Sheldon. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have children and adults that require a lot of support. They're not independent, and they, as we'll discuss in the next few slides, because we have no effective treatment for them, they remain a big burden for their families and for their communities throughout their lifetime. And you know, that's a big problem, because today it's estimated that 1 in every 54 children is on the autism spectrum. And that represents a huge increase in prevalence from 1 in 5,000 in the 1970s to 1 in 54 just last year, 2020. And there are many reasons for this increase in prevalence. Can you think of some?
Yes, we can. It's very
Increased
good.
prevalence of diagnosis based on doctors being more sensitive to the profile.
Right, there's a change in definitions, absolutely right, Jennifer. There's a change in definitions, and you know that autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, is still defined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, and that manual keeps changing every few years. The last change was 2013, where we dropped the definition of Asperger syndrome, and we now just have the autism spectrum. And every few years the definitions change because we think we can we understand it better, so we can come up with more sensitive and specific symptomatic definitions. But this is just some of the reasons for the increase in prevalence. Can you think of any other reasons?
Yes, it's a hot potato, but defective vaccines.
Okay, that's a reason that some believed, but we now know that it's not the vaccines, and it's not refrigerator moms that cause autism, but actually a very strong genetic component. And I'm showing you here twin concordance rates. What are they? Twin concordance is the probability that one twin will be on the spectrum if we know that the other twin is on the spectrum. For monozygotic twins that share 100% of their DNA, which is their genetic material, and their uterine environment, that chance is about 85%. And for dizygotic twins that share 50% of their genetic material, that's about 25%. And you know, previously I told you that autism or ASD has a prevalence of about 2% in the general population. So these figures of about 85 concordance rate for monozygotic twins and 25% on average for dizygotic twins, these figures make autism one of the most heritable complex traits. What do I mean by complex trait? It means that no single gene causes autism, but a combination of genes that act during brain development in response to a set of environmental exposures gives rise to a continuous distribution of autistic traits in the general population. And individuals with ASD are at the extreme end of this distribution. So each one of us is somewhere in this multidimensional distribution. Obviously, it's not just one dimension. There's no single autistic trait. And individuals that are defined clinically with ASD are just the tip of this distribution. And if we want to understand it, ASD and social and communication abilities and their genetic basis, we need to study the entire distribution, because most of the variance is captured outside the clinical scope of ASD. And that's what we, my lab and others have done. Do you have any questions about this?
Did you answer your own question about why the prevalence of autism would be becoming more common, which would seem counterintuitive, like that would be implying that autism became selected for, that people with autism are more successful at reproducing, that would become more common?
So that's a very, very good comment. And the fact that prevalence has gone up means that there are more diagnoses. It doesn't mean that there are more individuals with ASD in the world. And there are many reasons for this increase in diagnoses. One is the changes in definition, and the other is social benefits for being diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, ASD, over other neurodevelopmental disorders. For example, back in the day, first of all, we know that many children with ASD also have intellectual disability, but obviously not all of them. And back in the day, there used to be a main diagnosis of intellectual disability and a secondary diagnosis of ASD. And now parents have some incentive to have their main diagnosis of their children be ASD instead of intellectual disability, because that way they can go to regular schools and not special education. They get support in that school. They get more behavioral intervention early on, more services in many countries around the world. And so parents, which are the initiators of this entire diagnostic procedure, which is not that simple, parents have an incentive to have their children diagnosed. A few decades ago, you might think that since there's no treatment anyways, there's no need to spend long days going to a developmental medicine clinic and waiting in line and having a whole battery of observations be done on the child just to get a label of some sort of neurodevelopmental disorder. But today, because we have, we're offering early behavioral intervention programs and better educational solutions to these children, there is benefit for the parents to have their children diagnosed.
Could you reiterate, please, what you meant about the variation in the distribution? I'm not sure I caught what you were saying.
So we wanna understand the genetic basis for having one individual here at the end of this distribution, clinically on the autism spectrum, and another individual here in the middle of this distribution, and other individuals here. And in order to understand what is the genetic basis for being in a certain location in this distribution, we have models that try to explain the variance in the distribution. And we try to use genetic information to predict the outcome. And we, in the scientific lingo, we call it genotype-phenotype correlations. We're trying to relate a specific genetic makeup to a specific phenotypic outcome, specific trait, a specific ability.
Thank you.
That's what I meant. Okay, so moving on, what do we know about ASD genetics? I'm showing you here the 24 chromosomes of the human genome. And you can see that on almost every chromosome, we have a red or a green dot. And this signifies that almost any chromosomal region has been implicated in some way or another with ASD. It means that there is no certain region in the genome that is responsible for ASD, but that it's widespread. And we call it extreme locus heterogeneity. Locus is a region in the genome. And that comes to show that the heritability or the genetic makeup of ASD is very complex. And specifically, when we look at the types of mutations or variants, which are changes in the DNA that have been implicated with autism, most of them are very rare. They appear in a very small fraction of individuals, and their minority is common, meaning that they're shared among many other individuals. And when we look at mutation types or types of genetic events that could give rise or predispose to ASD, we see that every mutation type that was ever studied has been associated in some way or another with ASD. So we're talking about really extreme heterogeneity, both in terms of the locations in the genome or loci, in terms of variant frequency, in terms of variant types, and altogether, with all the really incredible genetic advances that we've enjoyed in the past 2 decades, we think that more than 500 genes out of about 20,000 genes that code for proteins have something to do with autism. And this number keeps changing, and it really depends on how you implicate these genes and variants within them with autism. But it's a very large number. And now, so even though we have this huge complexity, still we think we know what causes autism in less than 1/3 of individuals on the spectrum. So with all of this complexity, it's not surprising that we don't make use of genetic information to diagnose individuals on the spectrum, but we only use it for a clinical evaluation after a child has been diagnosed, in order to inform the family note very rare types of autism that could somehow be treated. And so we're not making the best use of the genetic information that we have at hand. Any questions?
Yes, can I ask, could you reiterate, what are the main environmental causes?
So that's a very good question. We still don't know, but what we do know, and that would also lead me to my next slide, is, for example, that immune challenges have a very big contribution to risk. And for example, mothers that have a viral infection, such as influenza, the flu, or you all remember Zika from a few years ago.
Yeah.
The Zika pandemic led to children with no brains even. And other viruses and infections that are long gone, like rubella, that really increase the risk for autism in the child. All of these are examples of maternal inflammation, so response to some infection, that has been associated in humans with altered neurodevelopment in the offspring. And when we look in mice and in monkeys, we can specifically induce maternal inflammation. So we can mimic viral infection during pregnancy. And many of the pups in mice and the offsprings in monkeys have behavioral issues and neurodevelopmental alterations that mimic autism. So one of them, so we conclude from all of these studies, not just we, and it's not just my study, but very big group of researchers that have studied it, not only in humans, but as I said, also in model organisms, so that we can better distinguish the causes from the associations. The conclusion is that activation or hyperactivation of the maternal immune system during pregnancy gives rise to, first of all, it has been shown that it messes up brain development, and I can talk about this for a whole hour. We know the mechanisms, we know which brain regions. Still, there's a lot to study, but that's a recent progress that has been done in the field. And so that's an environmental factor that predisposes to autism. It's not deterministic because it depends on some other environmental factors, not necessarily related, such as your gut microbiome, all the bacteria in your gut. And these have been shown to cause autism in model organisms and to increase the risk for autism in humans. Pretty exciting avenue of research in recent years.
Thanks. Wow.
So what I've just described in my very long introduction here is a huge complexity, very many different genetic causes for ASD. And I have to say that not all of these genes and variants that I've discussed are altered in every individual on the spectrum. But actually each family has a subset, a combination of a subset of these that causes autism in that family. However, while these are rare, when we look at all of the families, they have something in common, and they converge at the functional level. And we have several functional relationships between the many genes and mutations that have been linked with autism. One of the links is synaptic function here on the left. And if you know, you probably know this, nerves, our brain cells communicate with one another by transmitting electrical signals that are called synapses. And if these synapses are dysfunctional, or if they can't be maintained, they don't develop properly, then you can't really build complex cognitive models that respond to the changing environment. And obviously, the link between altered synaptic function and altered behavior is pretty straightforward. Another thing that I just discussed is the immune function. Many genes and mutations were found to affect immune function. The immune system not only is responsible for signaling the brain cells where to go when the brain develops, but also in adulthood, the immune system removes suboptimal connections, so suboptimal synapses, are being pruned by the immune system. And this function or dysregulation of this mechanism has been associated with many neurodevelopmental alterations, including autism. And the last functional relationship between the many different causes of autism is that many of them are related to control of which genes are expressed at during which time points and which cells. So, you know, the brain is one of our most complex organs. We have very tight control of which of the genes and gene expression programs that function during different times and different locations in our brains. So this is kind of a popular science introduction to the genetics of autism. And to summarize, we have a very complex problem. It's very common. It's male dominant. 1 in about 38 boys is diagnosed with ASD these days. And we have no effective treatment because we don't understand the cause in most children. We can't really treat the cause. We can only alleviate symptoms. And we have often delayed symptoms-based diagnosis. The diagnosis is based only on the 2 symptoms that I mentioned, reduced social communication abilities and increased repetitive and stereotypical behaviors. And so you have to wait until we're sure that the child does not develop social abilities that we expect at a certain age. And we can only do that usually by 18 months of age. And so that lets critical developmental time windows go by with no intervention. It's a big problem. And I've shown you that we have really a large clinical and molecular heterogeneity. And, but still, with all this huge heterogeneity and huge complexity on all fronts, we have some emerging subtypes, or what we like to call convergent etiologies. Many different causes are functionally related. So when we have such complex problems with emerging subtypes, we turn into precision medicine. And the idea of precision medicine is just like our maps on our smartphones. When you know that we're trying to assess the real world around us, we always integrate different layers of information. For example, we can have information about cities, streets, gas stations, ATMs, COVID frequencies, where we can get tested for coronavirus, etc. All of these layers of information are integrated in our maps based on some geographic system. And similarly, in medicine, it's not new. We never have one specialist that can take care of all of our problems. And when we have a complex medical problem, we attend to different specialists that each considers our medical problem from their own perspective. So for example, my grandma that has lots of geriatric issues, and she's 95, so obviously many different tissue systems and organs in her body are sub-functioning. And so if she has some muscle pain, she goes and sees her orthopedic surgeon. She has some cardiac problems, she goes to her cardiologist. If she has some skeletal issues because she's so old, she goes and sees different specialists for that. So similarly, that's the difference between traditional medicine and precision medicine is that we're now switching from the organ and the tissue level to the cellular level. And what we're trying to do here, we're trying to understand the cellular and molecular mechanisms that give rise to disease. And we do that by integrating different omic measurements. These can be metabolomics, measuring the different metabolites that are present within the cell, proteomics, measuring all the protein content of cells, RNA profiling or transcriptomics, measuring gene expression, which genes are expressed in the cells, and genomics, measuring the DNA variation that gives rise to all these changes. And as I said, the goal of precision medicine is to understand the specific cellular and molecular alterations that give rise to a certain disease in a certain individual. And okay, so that's all good, and makes sense to apply these techniques these days when we can actually measure all these things. But in order to achieve that, we need to measure, to have all of these different measurements on many different individuals, and we're not there yet. There are certain precision medicine initiatives in the US, in Israel too, but in autism, in ASD, we haven't done all these measurements on a large enough cohort. So the paper that you mentioned and that I'd like to present to you tries to address that. And what we did was integrate different aspects of molecular measurements from different cohorts. And what kind of measurements did we have? We had a whole exome variation, which is looking at the genetic variation, the DNA changes that are present in the 1% of the genome that codes for proteins. We also looked at segregation patterns, looking at how genetic variation tracks with the trait of interest, ASD. We also had looked at expression correlation. We also, and I'll talk more about this, we also looked at sexually dimorphic expression patterns, because we know that most of the individuals on the spectrum are boys. And then we enjoyed the amazing resource of electronic health records, which we all are aware of in Israel. When we go to our doctor, every record is digital, and our physician in Israel always has our medical history ready to examine in the computer. But that hasn't been the case a few years back, and it's not the case in the United States. It's changing though. And so this type of information, which we already have really a lot of, can be used to validate our molecular and cellular hypotheses that we make in other data types. So let me briefly tell you what we did. I'm not going to go into details because I see that you're getting tired. We integrated all of these different types of information. Let me skip it. So what did we do? We first took expression data. So this is measurements of the levels of genes, how they are expressed during brain development. And we took a very large data set of gene expression in human brain development, and we clustered it according to co-expression patterns. What does that mean? It means that we looked for genes that function together during brain development. And then we asked these genes that function together during brain development, can we differentiate between their expression in the developing male brain as compared to the developing female brain? And we specifically looked for these sets of genes that function together during early brain development that are also different between males and females. And we then asked what are changes in the DNA of children with ASD that are found in these genes. And specifically, we looked at changes that we think damage the function of these genes. And specifically, also, we looked at changes that track together with ASD in families. So we have multiplex families. These are families that have multiple affected siblings with autism. So we wanted to look for DNA changes, variants, that are shared among multiple affected siblings from the same family, and those that are different between one sibling with autism and the other sibling that has no autism. And using all of this computational exercise, we identified clusters of variants or DNA changes that affect sets of genes that function together during brain development in a different way between males and females. And then we used electronic health records. So patient-doctor visits, diagnosis, etc., and try to validate our hypotheses. So I'm gonna skip all this because it's getting late, and jump to.
Ellie, no, you don't have to skip. It's actually quite amazing. We intrigued in your presentation.
Yeah,
Our
but
programs sometimes go for hours, like however much.
No. What you're doing here is it's unbelievable. It's very
Yeah,
interesting. You mustn't
thank you,
skip.
thank you. Let me jump to the chase. You know, tell you what we found. Less technical and more results oriented. So what did we find? As I showed you that we integrated all these types of information. We looked at genetic changes that are inherited from parents to children, that are inherited differently between children with autism and children without autism, that we know affect multiple genes that function together during brain development in a different way between males and females. So what did we find in these clusters of genes? Most of them had to do with functions that we already knew are associated with autism, such as immune function or transcriptional regulation, synaptic function. Remember the slide that I showed you in the introduction. But we also found 20% of the clusters had to do with lipid regulation, so controlling fats. And here's an example of one of these clusters. This is a very simple cluster of only one gene, lipoprotein lipase, and it has many different exons. These are components of genes that give rise to different variants of the same gene. And I'm showing you, and all of these exons are co-expressed, so they're expressed together. And I'm showing you here a QQ plot that shows that when we look at affected siblings or probands and compare them to their unaffected siblings, we see that the probands have more mutations that we think damage this gene's function, LPL function, as compared to mutations found in their own brothers or sisters. And here I'm showing you that this gene, LPL, is expressed differently between males and females during prenatal brain development, which is the period of brain development when we think autism arises. So you see there's a gap between the red and blue lines here. And another example of a cluster, of a very simple cluster with only one gene, is this cluster of a handful of exons, gene parts, of the low density lipoprotein receptor, or LDLR. And this gene is also expressed differently between males and females during prenatal brain development. And here in part C, we're looking at 50 families with multiple affected siblings. And we see that in 5 of these families, we have multiple siblings that have mutations in this gene that we think damage its function. And these mutations are also shared among multiple siblings that have autism. And one last example of these clusters that provide evidence for the implication of lipid regulation. Here we're looking at a large cluster that has 84 genes. And these genes, many of these genes are part of one pathway that is metabolism of lipids and lipoproteins. I'm showing you this pathway here. And here you can see a hairball that shows you how big this cluster is, highlighting all the genes that are part of this pathway. And you can also see that they're expressed in a different way between males and females during early brain development. And here, this is one example. Previously, I've shown you just very simple single gene clusters. One example of a cluster, genes that are expressed together during early brain development that all function in the same pathway, so same molecular function, and differently between males and females. And so now, using this integration of the very different data types, segregation patterns, heritability patterns, variants in whole exome sequencing, mutation types, and expression data, and sexually dimorphic expression patterns. So now after integrating all these different data types, we now have a hypothesis to test based on our findings. So our hypothesis is that lipid dysregulation might be a convergent etiology in ASD, meaning that many different families in ASD, one of the causes of autism there, or one of the molecular reasons making them at high risk for autism is lipid dysregulation. So how can we test this hypothesis? We think we know what these genes do. We think that LPL, that I've shown you before, hydrolyzes triglyceride-rich lipoproteins into VLDL remnants. And we think that LDLR, that I've shown you before, internalizes LDL particles into cells where they have a bunch of downstream functions. So if these two genes don't function, what do we expect? We expect to see increased levels of triglycerides and cholesterol in the blood of individuals with autism that have these mutations. And that is something that we can test because I am still part of Boston Children's Hospital. I can look at the electronic medical records of children treated at Boston Children's Hospital, and we can compare the typical blood lipid test results between kids with autism and kids with no autism. And we can see that many children with autism have blood lipid profiles that are outside the physiological range. So here I'm showing you the association between altered lipid profiles and autism. Specifically, we're talking about low density lipoprotein, total cholesterol, triglycerides. This figure shows you that having abnormal measures, whether it's too high or too low, is associated with autism. And if you want to look at the actual levels, not just the association, we have this very nice analysis that we've done here. We're not only looking at the actual levels, but we're also stratifying on factors that we know affect lipid levels. For example, being obese, having diabetes, being male, being a female, or being at a certain age, all are associated with different lipid levels. So we can't really compare a 3-year-old boy with a 20-year-old obese man. And here, what this graph shows you is that in each stratum, when we look specifically in different sexes, here on top, and in different metabolic conditions on the bottom, and across different ages, we see consistently different levels here of triglycerides. I can also show you for the same plots for the other lipids that we've measured. So this is pretty consistent. We can conclude that altered lipid profiles are associated with ASD. And how else can we strengthen or test our hypothesis? We can also look at healthcare claims. So you know that in the US, you have a healthcare insurer that makes sure to pay for what you're covered and to charge you for what you're not covered. And so the healthcare insurance company keeps track of all of your medical events and history. And we can use that data, thankfully, we can make good use of that data, and not only to charge the patient and the family, but also for research. And so using the data from Aetna, which is a large insurer in the US, we have identified about 40,000 families with ASD and controls, and we can compare the rate of dyslipidemia. So these are dysregulation of lipids, various disorders of lipid dysregulation. We can compare their rates in individuals with ASD and individuals that have no ASD. And here you can see that individuals with ASD tend to have more such diagnoses. So they tend to have more hyperlipidemia or mixed hyperlipidemia, lipoprotein disorders, lipid metabolism disorders, et cetera, different types of lipid regulation problems that we find to be more common in individuals with autism as compared to matched individuals with no autism. Now, importantly, we're talking about 6.5% of all individuals on the spectrum. So this is not like all individuals with autism are now reported to have lipid problems. A very small fraction of them are, but still 6.5% is much higher than other known causes or associated comorbidities with autism. And another very important finding in the study, and using the same data, is that we looked at the parents of these children, and we see an increased risk or increased rate of lipid problems in mothers and also in fathers. And remember that I've previously shown you a convergence of mutations that are inherited in children with ASD that converge on lipid regulation pathways. So here we find that individuals with mothers and fathers that have lipid regulation problems are also at increased risk of having a child with ASD. Now, is this risk ginormous? It's not ginormous at all, but it is an important finding because we today cannot quantify risk. We have a very hard problem consulting parents about their risk for autism. And so any piece of evidence that is robust enough and statistically significant is important in this domain. We also looked at other characteristics of individuals with autism that also have dyslipidemia or lipid regulation problems. And we find that they also have other metabolic issues, other endocrinologic issues, and a very distinct set of additional problems, what we call comorbidities. And a very important question that was asked is, what about drug effects? We know that certain drugs that are very common in autism might lead to lipid regulation issues. For example, I'm showing you here different antipsychotic drugs that are often prescribed to children with autism to control their maladaptive behaviors. And here's the paper that showed that these drugs are associated with weight gain and dyslipidemia. So you might think that our findings are indirectly related to autism and that the main driver of these findings are these drugs. So then we specifically examined individuals that have no record of taking not only antipsychotics, but also anticonvulsants and anti-diabetic drugs that are all known to alter lipid levels. And we still find a strong association between dyslipidemia and autism, even when we control for drug use. And on the left, we're looking at individuals with comorbid dyslipidemia out of all individuals with ASD or control. And on the right, we're looking at individuals with ASD out of all individuals with dyslipidemia or control. So it's a mirror image of each other, complementary image of the statistics, demonstrating that drugs do have some impact, but our signal is not coming from drugs. It's most likely inherited from the parents. I'm not gonna go into that. I just wanna tell you how does this finding relate to our prior knowledge in this domain. And so here you're looking at a child with SLOS, Smith-Lemli-Opitz syndrome. This is a very, very rare syndrome of cholesterol metabolism. And almost all individuals with this syndrome also have ASD. And so this is an example of a very rare form of ASD that is known to be caused by cholesterol metabolism deficits. And this is a kind of a gold standard example of how cholesterol metabolism issues and give rise to brain development abnormalities, and specifically autism. One last piece of evidence to give different perspectives of the story is mice. You know that we love working with model organisms, and we can also look at mouse models of dyslipidemia and mouse models of autism and compare their behaviors. And lo and behold, they have many different similar behaviors. They have both models of dyslipidemia and models of autism have abnormal synapse morphology, so their cell connections look similarly abnormal. They similarly have problems learning. They similarly have morphological problems, more than you would expect by chance. And one last piece of evidence from mice comes from looking at all of their behaviors and all of their phenotypes, or how they not only behave, but how they look like, and certain measurements that can be made about them. And when we do that and look at all the data that has been collected about these mice, we can group together or cluster the different models based on their phenotypes. And if autism and dyslipidemia were completely unrelated, you would have expected the orange names here, that these are names of genes that were engineered in these mice to be dysfunctional. And in orange are genes that cause dyslipidemia, and in blue are genes that cause autism. And in red is our gold standard gene that gives rise to SLOS, the syndrome of cholesterol metabolism that's known to cause autism. And so had they been unrelated, you would have expected to have all of the blue together, all of the orange together, and the red separating the two. But instead, we see that many different autism models are actually more similar to dyslipidemia models than to other autism models. And this suggests that there are many phenotypic similarities between dyslipidemia and autism, and that they are not only phenotypically similar, but also molecularly similar. Because when we engineer one gene, there are many other genes that respond to that change. So I just want to let you know, what do we know about lipids in the human brain? How can they cause autism theoretically? We still need to test that. So first of all, 60% of the brain, of the human brain, is fat. And fats, lipids, are essential building blocks of cell membranes, different types of cells. And so they're crucial for maintaining, for example, synaptic function that we've mentioned several times during this talk. They are also important in signaling, and they're also immune mediators that is related to our other convergent etiology that we've discussed. And now it's time to summarize our findings. This is integrative work that combines data and knowledge that suggests that lipid dysregulation may define a specific autism subtype. And as you've said before, this was recently published in August in Nature Medicine. And in this paper and in this presentation, we integrated many different molecular data types that suggested that lipid dysregulation might be a convergent etiology in ASD. And we then tested this hypothesis in blood lipid profiles in children with ASD. We saw that they are altered as compared to their matched controls. We also found enrichment of dyslipidemia diagnoses in individuals with ASD and their parents as compared to matched controls. I didn't show you, but I can tell you that when we controlled for lifestyle, we also found the enrichment of dyslipidemia diagnoses in individuals with ASD as compared to their unaffected SIBs. We found shared neurobehavioral phenotypes among mouse models of ASD and dyslipidemia. And we had several stratification analyses showing that drugs alone cannot explain these observations. And obviously, the study has several implications for early screening, maybe opportunities for intervention, and overall for enabling precision medicine of ASD. And this is an example of how we can use multiple unbiased data modalities for understanding the different causes of ASD and dissecting the big heterogeneous spectrum. And of course, this is not my own work, but a very big team of many talented individuals, specifically this guy right here, Yuan Luo, now a PI, now a professor in Northwestern University in Chicago, and my colleagues from Harvard Medical School, Nathan, Paul, Pete Solovich, Zach Ohani, and Ami Levy, who's also Israeli, that all had a very important role in this study. And if you have any questions, I'd love to answer them now.
Wow, so Dr. Eran, it's been absolutely riveting. It's been amazing, your research and what you've done. So I'm going to open up the floor. If anybody's got any comments or questions, please go ahead. Just to unmute.
Yeah, fascinating. That was excellent. I don't know if any of us have expertise in genetics, although I have a lot of general questions about autism, if that's okay. I don't know if Jennifer or anybody looking historically at autism and like mental diseases. You just say myself, I'm a chess coach. I have a lot of experience dealing with autism, and I've read a lot of the studies related to autism. Just as you were speaking, I was reading some Dorit Ben Sholom's work because I'm interested in consciousness. And then, you know, the question, I guess, historically, that they thought autists experience conscious in a different way or didn't recognize that other people thought, or how they expressed that, to now, you know, more neurological genetic definitions to what's going on, and also the science of learning, specifically chess, which has been shown that low IQ people could become extremely good chess players. You know, historically, like the Queen's Gambit, even if you saw the recent movie with Beth Harmon, there was a lot of discussion whether Beth Harmon in the Queen's Gambit movie is autistic. And you know, the question, I also a lot of research into the theory of expertise. And you know, so if an autistic person with a low IQ could accomplish certain tasks, is that proof that it doesn't actually require large amounts of intelligence, like the calendar trick or something that a lot of special autists could perform? That there are studies that showed that really it's not that difficult, that even a person with like a 60 IQ over a period of years studying could figure out how to do the calendar trick versus mystical, like maybe there are some special mental abilities, memory. I'm not sure you have any thoughts on generally autism, consciousness, expertise, special skills, or the use of autism studying, you know, IQ studies that, you know, try to demonstrate that even autists with low IQs are capable of performing expert level tasks sometimes.
Yeah, very good questions. So individuals with IQ of 60, and by definition less than 70, they're considered intellectually disabled, which is, you know, a sister diagnosis, let's call it this way. And that means that their brain did not develop properly. Obviously, individuals with ASD also had some brain development abnormality, but intellectual disability could be thought of by many as, you know, more is the dominating diagnosis before autism. And so teaching these rules to individuals with low IQ, and does that teach us anything about cognition? That's I think a philosophical question. And of course, human cognition, it has a great variability. And I mean, it's really philosophical definition, but obviously individuals with low IQ are capable of performing high tasks that require high cognition. It also, we have to revisit IQ measurements and what they test, and following rules could be performed even by, you know, non-human animals. And so I don't think that you can make any inferences based on IQ alone. As to your question about consciousness, that's a really good question. I think we're all conscious.
I was skimming Dorit Ben Sholom's paper, and it looked like she even had like a model that people were saying that maybe there's a normal model of consciousness and that autists have an alternative conscious processing method.
Who knows? You know, we haven't measured that. There are many, you know, functional imaging like MRI, fMRI, that's trying to assess that. There are many differences between individuals, and because the autism spectrum is so heterogeneous and no conclusive finding has been made to date, we do know conclusively that individuals with ASD have a problem regulating senses. So they're either hyper or hyposensitive, which is the cause of many maladaptive behaviors. But specifically about consciousness, the jury is still out on that.
Yeah, I'm interested in the other questions also. Maybe we'll come back to the Haredi populations, because also I used to work at Minyanim, and I remember many probably autistic or different forms of people that of mental disorders that were largely capable of functioning in Haredi society. I mean, they could come and they could daven with a minyan, and like I was a gabbai at the shul, so I knew that there would be a group of people from a special home coming, but they still came. They wanted to come pray with a minyan, and relatively, despite their mental disabilities, that factor of davening with a minyan, you know, keeping Jewish halakha or whatever, most of them were widely capable of doing that. I'm sure Lowell and Les in Jerusalem, you know, is aware of that, because now I'm not in such Orthodox circles, I almost never meet autistic people, but you know, saying that in Haredi circles, yeah, like most autistic people show up to minyan.
Yeah, I've got patients who are autistic as well. Yeah, and they're in the mainstream. Yeah, I'd agree, actually. Yeah.
Well, I had to learn that, you know, because I was a gabbai in a synagogue. So like, no, these guys come in, like, just make sure nothing, you know, happens, but they're just going to come in daven with minyan like everybody else. And I mean, so these guys weren't just autistic. A lot of these people had much more severe mental problems, but factually, they were all able to come in and, you know, successfully, like we mentioned, the special mental skills, but, you know, say like, yeah, a person with a 60 IQ could probably still figure out how to daven with a minyan.
Can I just make a comment here? In South Africa, in Glen Hazel Shul, it's the main shul in Johannesburg, or one of the main shuls, possibly the main shul. So one of the main components of that shul is that they bring the residents who are autistic or have mental disabilities, and they are an integral part of the shul. They include them in everything in the shul, and people have them over for Shabbat, and they actually are very admired. It's a wonderful thing. So the kids, you know, see them as very special people, and they integrate very well within the community. And I think it's just that's the way it should be. It's such a wonderful.
Yeah, I'll wait a little bit, but I mean, from my understanding, it's even incorporated into Judaism superstition to look like these people are special. So I was like, you're like, oh, a blessing from a mentally challenged person, superstitious, is more likely to come true. So if you're like autistic person blesses you, that's a special sign from Hashem, as opposed to a blessing from a regular person. And these superstitions, so to say, you know, from anthropological perspective, have been incorporated so that you know, what Les is talking about is quite normal, you know, versus like a spiritual, you know, reincarnation or true, like, what is there something different about these people at a soul level of why they're like this, or even the consciousness level where there could be fantastical versions of actually autistic people perceive reality better than the rest of us. It's not that, you know, so to say, like, you know, like they're the ones that are normal. We're actually the ones that are abnormal.
I have a question / comment at this point. Aside from my own diagnosis in 2015, when I graduated from Swarthmore College in 1979, as I have a special major in religion and the philosophy of science. I wasn't interested in numbers and mathematics so much. I was interested in the other side of it. So what I'm especially interested in is people on the spectrum way at the other end of the spectrum, people like Alan Turing and Albert Einstein. And the IDF has a special unit established by Tamir Pardo, the former head of the Mossad, of people, young soldiers on the autistic spectrum / Asperger's, who are in a special intelligence unit. They have the ability, I don't have those abilities, to read maps and see patterns and photos that the Bedouin trackers can't see. So I would be very interested, we've been discussing people with IQs of 60 and limited abilities. I'm interested in, especially for myself, in the study of people with extraordinary savant capabilities, the kind of people who come up with our scientific discoveries and technological inventions. People like Gregor Mendel, who discovered the laws of genetics, fiddling with pea pods in the monastery garden. He was so far beyond everyone else. They didn't know what he was talking about. Nobody even, he failed the test to become a teacher, test for this, test for that. The only reason anyone discovered his work is years after he was dead, someone found some copies of his paper and said, wait a minute, look at what this guy came up with. Another example of that is Einstein, when he came out with his famous paper from 1905 with his equals MC square. He sent his analysis to all the physics magazines at the time. There were about 20 of them. No one paid any attention to him, except for Max Planck, who said, wait a minute, I don't understand what this young man is saying, but he's on to something. The rest is history. The others didn't pay attention. They thought he was talking Mongolian. They didn't understand the language. So I'm very interested in research with people at the high end of the spectrum who often are not treated very well in general society, beaten up on the playgrounds as kids, who come up with ME262s and technologies that quantum leap above what we have, also the subject of resentment and envy and hatred by others who don't have those abilities. I'll give you an example of that, then I'll finish my question / comment. David Ogilvy, who was a phenomenal genius himself, who founded the advertising PR firm of Ogilvy and Mather, lived till over 100, from Scotland, was one of Churchill's Baker Street boys in Washington. In one of his books, he said, it is often said that mediocre men do not recognize men of achievement. He said, I, David Ogilvy, disagree. I believe that mediocre men recognize men of exceptional achievement, resent them, and seek to destroy them. I'll rest my comments question there.
So you're right that the savant abilities are of great interest, and that shows you that autistic traits are not necessarily deleterious, but actually advantageous in today's world. And many of our greatest scientists and mathematicians are on the high functioning end or low support end of the autism spectrum. And I did my PhD at MIT. I can tell you that the frequency of individuals on the spectrum there is quite high, and it's very advantageous to be able to focus on the details and keep on beating your head against a certain problem and not letting go. And You know, there are some people that think that California has large rates of autism diagnoses because of all the parents there in Silicon Valley getting married and having children, and their extreme abilities, extreme engineering abilities, and what we call STEM capabilities are indicative of some subclinical autistic features, meaning that they are less social than others and more focused on details than others, but are not on the spectrum. And just having them mate might be one of the reasons for the increased rate of ASD in California. That's just a belief, hasn't been proved. But my conclusion and my take-home message is that autistic traits are not necessarily deleterious. They can be advantageous in many aspects of life. The only thing that is absolutely requires support are individuals on the low end of the spectrum. We need to find a way to help them. We need to find pharmacological approaches to ease their pain, to ease their family's pain. And in the very rare cases of, you know, very severe cases, we need to be able to prevent them.
It's interesting, the Haredi integration, because if you think about the basic function of what it means to be Haredi, even someone on the low end of the spectrum could probably meet that standard of, as opposed to in regular society where it's hard to integrate people. And I'm not, are you familiar with the friendship circles across America? And I mean, it started here in Metro Detroit. Rabbi Levi Shem Tov, my YouTube channel, cousins with a lot of the Chabad Rabbi Shem Tovs, but they have a training center, and it has like a mini town in order to teach autistic people how to deal with basic functioning. So it has like I think it used to even have a station police officer, but have like stoplights and a barber shop and a post office. And then there would be people in there in order to kind of role play, act out, teaching people how to function, and not just designed for autism, but that's the main use of it. But you're just teaching people the basic functioning within society, so that an autistic person, you would know how to walk on a street corner, find a police officer, wait for a stoplight, go into a barber shop, and get a haircut. And it's actually became quite popular, where they have now tens of them across the world. And you know, as said, in Orthodox culture, it might be more usual to attempt to integrate it, because in reality, most of the things that Orthodox Jews do, even a person at the low end of the spectrum could successfully do, as opposed to in, you know, even secular Israeli society. It might be dangerous for an autistic person to be on the street corner. They might get beat up. They might get hit by a car. They might not be able to walk into a store and you know, do a monetary transaction or mail a letter or these things. But the interesting, it's Chabad Hasidim that have created this pretty popular method that you know, here in Metro Detroit, thousands of people all across Michigan come to the center for, you know, this autism training, to, you know, in hopes that their children will be able to at least be integrated into basic aspects of society. You know, safe to send them to a, you know, like driving might, you know, you have to be reasonably high skilled to get a license and drive, but even walking, to trust someone on the street that they're not going to get beaten up, robbed, hit by a car, or going to be able to fulfill the function. Like, you know, their goal was to go to the barber and get a haircut.
It's very nice.
So can I just mention on this, in Jerusalem, they've got, it's called the Friendship Circle, where they have a, it's baseball. They actually have a baseball tournament, and they have the top basketball players in the country from Maccabi Tel Aviv, from Hapoel, who come, and they have like a little baseball game with these kids, and they make them feel so important. And it's just, it's so wonderful. And it's like the highlight of the year for many, many families, where they have inclusive, with all the families come together. And it's just such a wonderful thing. It's a very positive thing.
Yeah, I would like to add something here. It just came to mind. Dr. Hans Asperger, who wrote his paper as a psychiatrist, which he published on the syndromes or profile in 1944, research showed, and I think, I don't know when this came out, that he was a little bit of a war criminal. Why was he didn't just happen to stumble on teenagers with unusual abilities along with peculiarities. The Nazi regime wanted him to do this research because in one way, the trouble is they wanted to locate kids with unusual abilities to integrate into their war program and use those abilities. Along the way, the Nazis had something called the T4 program. Before they got to work on exterminating us from 1939 to 1941, I think about almost 150, a huge number of mentally and physically defective people were sent to gas chambers and other forms of extermination until Germans found out about it and protested, which raises an important point. Is protest possible in a society like Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union? Yes. When Bishop von Galen found out about this, there were protests all over the country and Hitler backed down. They don't have unlimited power. In the Soviet Union, they wanted to ban vodka in the 1930s. People said, you can put us in a labor camp. We're not going to give up our vodka. And then the communists, the Soviet Bolshevik regime backed down. So the idea that there are societies that are so powerful and so terrifying is a falsehood. All societies, whether they're democratic structure, whatever, to some extent, you have to have the support of your people. You can't kill everybody. You have to have somebody behind you. So in both cases, they backed down. But he was looking for kids. The Nazis, in one way, they were much more advanced. They were open to ideas. When they took Robert Goddard, was doing his research on rockets, he went to the morons and idiots in Washington. The British called them Colonel Blimps and said, wow, I'm doing all this research on rockets. Would you be interested? No. But who was interested? Werner von Braun and his team in Germany said, oh, that's great. You'll be our teacher. And he was teaching them up until the end of the 1930s when he was saying, wait a minute, I don't know if this is a good idea. He stopped. So another one was Frank Whittle, who invented a jet-propelled craft in the 1930s, went to the morons and idiots in the British Air Ministry. No. But when the people designing those kind of craft in Germany, okay, great idea. Colonel Charles de Gaulle wrote a book on tank warfare, which effectively ended his career until he became head of the Free French government. The morons and idiots in Paris said, don't tell us anything about tanks. But Hitler said, when Heinz Guderian came to him, said, wow, that's a great idea. Let's use that and let's think in a different way how to use the equipment we have. So time after again, you see the Nazis or the Horton brothers with a flying wing, with a technology so advanced that nobody knew what to do anything with it until the 1960s. Time after again, the Nazis were consistently open to new ideas. Leni Riefenstahl, a young lady, directing a film in the early 1930s. If you had talent and abilities, the brain-dead morons in Paris and London and Washington didn't listen. I hope it's better here. But Hitler and his crew said, wow, that's a great idea. Let's go with it. I can't comment on how people with unusual ideas are treated here because I'm not party to those discussions, but I would hope that you're treated better. I just want to add a footnote that Hans Asperger, after the war, he tried to justify, what did he do? While he was researching children who were exceptional, he found some who weren't so exceptional, said, put them on the bus to Hartheim Castle. After the war, he claimed he wasn't responsible. Of course, no one's ever responsible for anything if they get caught. But he was a little bit of he was Nazi, and he wasn't just doing this research. He was asked by the Nazi regime to do that research because, again, they were way ahead of the pack saying, okay, this is total war. I don't care if it's a 5-year-old. Can they contribute something? I hope we would have, I don't know, again, in Israel's military, industrial, scientific complex how it's handled here, but I would hope that there's an openness to unusual ideas which have military, social, economic, or political applications.
Absolutely. We're not so inclusive as a country, but I know this program firsthand, and it's very successful. And, you know, pattern detection abilities are quite rare, and these young men have it.
Maybe to context that answer, I was looking at I think it's a modern debate in Jewish law, in probably one of the most tested autistic debates in your field is probably the abortion debate. And I think, generally Jewish law values the mother's life over the child, as opposed to some Christian fundamentalists that value the life of the child over the mother. And if the mother knows that the child is going to have severe mental problems, certainly in Israel, among the Haredim and maybe modern Orthodox would be more lenient, to say there's no exception for an abortion. If there's no health risk to the mother and the child is just going to have severe mental problems, definitely the Haredim and even into mainstream Orthodox to modern Orthodox would say the abortion in that case is absolutely forbidden, versus the ethical practice of where there is no religious sanction, and just going to say ethically, can a person abort their kid because they know they're going to have autism? And I guess that's Lowell talking about the Nazi experiments, and it's not God forbid to talk about killing people with these problems, abortion at whatever level, but it seems a similar debate, and it's probably directly related to your field of study, because should you be able to figure this out, what's the likely use that people would use with the discoveries that you're doing? And chances are, God forbid, it would be immediately to abort babies. I don't know if I'm wrong about that.
So, of course, we need variability in human behavior, human traits. And, nothing is black and white. Of course, individuals on the high end of the spectrum, those that are high functioning savants, we need them in society. And there's no need to prevent the life of such individuals. But on the other hand, there are individuals that are that have the same label, autism spectrum disorder, that cannot spend 1 hour alone. They not only require constant support, but they're a danger to themselves, a menace to society, and they just cause a lot of misery. They're in pain. They can't regulate their own senses, and they keep banging their head and hurting others. And so, should such cases be prevented? I mean, if it were my child, I would want to prevent this. So this is still under debate. Obviously, you can misuse any type of information, not just genetic information. But I think that society would optimize making the best use of this information and preventing unneeded misery while preserving human variability.
That's an ethical dilemma that you obviously thought about well before you started your research.
I have a question about how long will it be, and/or will it be possible to repair defective genes? For example, people with autoimmune diseases like asthma. I've been reading that at a certain point, instead of using steroids, it will be possible to repair the defective genes for a variety of conditions. Would that also apply to people on certainly the lower end of the autistic spectrum? Is this theoretically possible, or is this Ponce de Leon looking for what was he looking for? The waters of life. He never found them. Do they exist? Is this a possibility, or is this a hopeless fantasy?
So, we didn't think we'll come up with a COVID vaccine within 10 months. Science is advancing rapidly. Right now, as of 2021, we can't edit the genome in humans. It's very difficult. We can't supplement genes what is called gene therapy. There are other ways, of course, to correct pharmacologically, but not genetically. Would it be possible in the future? Probably, but I can't tell you when.
Well, I have another question for right now. It's not fair to go on endlessly for questions till Shabbat, I know that, but one leads to the other. I've been reading, is this true, that, well, for example, what Ferdinand Laplace, when I was in high school, the orthodoxy was, when you're born with a genetic package, that's it, it's fixed in stone, and environment cannot, nurture cannot affect nature, environment can affect heredity. A couple of years ago, I was reading, wait a minute, Ferdinand Laplace, I think it was a French scientist around the time of the revolution who said this. Turns out he was right, that environment can affect heredity, and as all, we can now actually have devices that can see as our thoughts and feelings change from minute to minute, genes will be switched on, switched off, combined, uncombined, and that when Norman Vincent Peale was onto something when he wrote his book about the power of positive thinking, or Solomon was right when he says in the book of Ecclesiastes, as a man thinks, so he is. I don't think Solomon meant that if you create a visualization, you'll have 3 ears, you'll grow them, but that we have a tremendous ability to affect the genes are much more plastic than was thought when I went to school. Is that true?
That's absolutely right. Your genetic makeup or your DNA predisposes you to certain diseases, to certain traits, but it's always a combination of genes, the environment, and gene and environment interactions that give rise to the disease. Each trait has a different relative frequency of the contributions of genes or the environment of their interaction, but almost every single human trait is controlled by that combination of factors.
I didn't mention it during your lecture, but I'm thinking, and I'm not sure if Jennifer is still here or the time zone, but the statistical methods and, I was mentioning chess and the Alpha Zero, the Alpha Fold supposedly just came and figured out better than before the protein folding. Are you using machine learning algorithms?
Of course. Who's not using them?
Well, yeah, that's what I was assuming. You didn't mention, but that's what it takes to do your research, that you have to, that you couldn't figure it out yourself, and even you and your partners and greatest minds wouldn't be able to figure it out, but you could figure out how to program the computer to figure it out.
Yep.
And that might even somewhat relate to autism, to, the special abilities that some savants have, that is like, how'd they do it? But you're saying that you figured out how to program the computer to pick out these patterns.
Yep. I mean, we use what we can, we take what we can get, the computers can learn to recognize pattern better than us. They can classify, distinguish objects to different classes. And there are certain tasks that computers are just better than us. And you were talking about AlphaFold. So these are much more complex tasks that require what we call deep learning. And there are ways of using deep learning that really mimic human behavior. And, if you ask Elon Musk, or you ask me, or other people that...
Me and Jennifer are regular watchers of Lex Friedman. I don't know if you ever met Lex Friedman, but we watch his show pretty regularly, the MIT podcast about science. And I guess if you're affiliated with MIT, you probably have access to some of those latest programs to test your theories.
Yeah. So, but it's already here. You don't need to predict anything. You don't need to imagine it. It's here.
Well, you have a bunch of ideas like, oh, I wish I could figure this out. And you're just waiting for like a more powerful computer program to be able to implement your ideas. Is that how genetic research, like alpha folding that you know kind of what you want to do, the mysteries that want to be solved, and it's just a question of when the computer programs are going to be able to simulate it.
Yeah, and you know that you need to provide the computer enough data in order to learn. So
Yeah, that's what I was about to ask.
Yeah.
Like, where's the bottleneck in your training data?
right. So in genetics, we have many different variants, meaning DNA changes. You know that the human genome is 3.3 billion letters, and we have sequences from about, let's say, I'm exaggerating, 100 million, exaggerating. And so we still have more variability, you know, more dimensions than we have measurements. And so that's a problem. We need more measurements than there are possibilities. It's gonna get there very soon.
I was wondering if this is a bit off topic, but what would you say to someone who was worried that computers were gonna like take over the world, like in some sort of Terminator type situation? I'm not saying I feel that way. I just hear it a lot, and I was wondering, like, how would you push back on that, given that you actually work in this field?
I mean, it's a concern. I have to say that there are much greater risks to humanity than AI, artificial intelligence. So I didn't invest too much thought into this. But you know, there are more potential benefits to it than there are risks at this point. So I try to focus on the positive side.
But do you think there's a concern that one of these AI neural net machines will become conscious?
I don't know if the risk is by them becoming conscious, but of course they can take a lot of human jobs, and they can, you know, be more violent, for example, Terminator type. That it's not a problem to program a robot to be very violent and to focus on a specific type of target. I mean, it's doable. But there are also great possibilities. So I wouldn't completely be only afraid. Also be optimistic.
Yeah, we've both been on this podcast in Quebec. This guy, Jean-Francois Garepi, who actually, had a PhD in biology, and
yeah, we should ask her about his theory.
But yeah, he's got a theory of revolutionary phenotype, and his claim is that eventually we're going to hand the computer genetic engineering to the computer, and the scientists aren't really going to understand what's going on. That the computer, people now that if we could do it, would have, I want to do this, this, and that. But eventually, like you would probably know, is the computer produces better answers than even the best scientist, and that eventually we're going to hand over genetic engineering to the computer, and then at that point, it will create a process of never coming back, because we're not going to really know what the computer's doing, and it'd even be competitive. Like if you're talking, how do you do these things? Like, I don't know, the computer says this is the answer, and me as a scientist, all I could tell you is you're probably best off going with the computer answer.
We're far away from using, black boxes and black magic.
That sounds scary, doesn't it?
Yeah. We are not using any models these days, at least, that are difficult to interpret.
I have another question, which is, years ago, I read papers in which the authors suggested that all people have buried, not activated savant capabilities, which theoretically could be activated. I'll give you an example. It turns out that, like amphibians can regrow a limb. The frog's leg is cut off and grow a new leg. We apparently have the same abilities, but in the fuse box in our genome, those genes are switched off. So there are scientists working on how to switch them back on. So you lose an arm or a leg in an act, no problem, just grow a new one. Apparently we have the same ability as amphibians, but it's switched off. So these papers were saying that these remarkable savant capabilities, which even people who are diagnosed with very low IQs. They sit and stare at the wall all day, and all of a sudden they can just sit down and play Mozart. Where do they even know it from? That humanity, Joe Human, has these abilities. They're just like with the ability to regrow limbs switched off. And for me, coming from a religious perspective, it immediately references the prophet Joel, it's only 4 books, chapters, or 3 chapters, depending on who's dividing, which he says, in the end of new beginning of days, I, God, will pour out my spirit on all flesh. And your young men will prophesy, and your old men will see visions, and I will pour it out also on the handmaidens and the servants. It talks about a kind of general explosion in human consciousness, so that these remarkable, it seems so remarkable that most people, we are maybe shadows of what we could be, but the potential is in all of us to develop those capacities. So my question is, what do you think of this suggestion that Plony Ben Plony has within him an unearthed, unexcavated Einstein and Mozart?
And knowing several Plonies Ben Plonies, I don't believe that they can play Mozart, but you know, to be politically correct, we're all different. Not everybody has to play Mozart, and we each have our own abilities. And as we said, your genetic makeup is just, you know, the genetic component, one piece of the puzzle. It provides the potential, and every one of us needs to fulfill that potential, or add in, you know, training and the specific environment to fulfill that potential, and to achieve whatever you can. I'm getting tired, as you can tell.
Does that relate? I mean, it's probably one of the biggest controversies in America in science is the genetic differences in intelligence, racial differences, that big pushback on both directions in science is the study of autism linked to either supporting or opposing genetic racial differences in intelligence.
Autism is prevalent in all races, all ethnic backgrounds, and same rates. So luckily, we don't have to deal with these explosive questions.
Okay.
Is there a future to the research? Like, is it just it interested you and you end up in a niche, obviously important field that you know, I've dealt with people autism that, or is there a larger medical framework that this research is interesting for?
Yeah, first of all, it's a very common disorder, so it touches many families, and it could have already making some impact on many lives. And I think, thankfully, these days, science is more global, and I have the privilege to collaborate with many researchers and investigators, both clinical, theoretical, computational, experimental, that all study autism from different perspectives to improve the lives of these individuals and their families. And so we all together, you know, it's much better feeling of making impact when you're part of this big team. And we not only feel that we're making a difference for the families, but also for the research community. So altogether, I feel it's not a niche, and that I'm part of something greater than that.
Wow. Okay, that's
Awesome. Les?
Yeah, I just want to make I know it's getting late and you've been amazing. Ellie, you've been
Thanks.
incredible. You know, just before New Year, they had a article that 12 Israeli researchers from Tel Aviv University were among the top 50 in the fields in the world. And look, you coming from Ben Gurion and you the top in your field, I think one of the top in the world. How is it that Israel, which is such a small country, we really are in comparison, have one of the high, I mean, Hebrew U and Ben Gurion and the Technion and Glassman, these are regarded as the top universities worldwide with such a small population. So what is how come?
You're not allowed to
Why is
answer
it that
genetic differences in race in intelligence.
Yeah, no,
Judy says she's not allowed to answer genetic
you know
what is the
differences
mystery
in
behind
intelligence.
it? Maybe you
Jewish,
can unlock the mystery behind why from such a small country with such a small population, you know, we are disproportionate in not
yeah,
only
that's
scientific.
right. Because Jewish lifestyle for centuries, you know, has focused around learning, and we value it still to this very day. And there was a paper about 10 years ago about natural selection of Ashkenazi Jewish. I don't know if you know it. Lots of really bad science. But I think it's a tradition, Jewish tradition, to learn and appreciate learning and education that is behind these really great achievements of many universities in Israel.
Wow.
And it's a great honor to be part of the system.
So, you know, Lal, I think, Ellie, we have to get you back because you could spend the whole night. And I think we really could. But I'm sure you're tired and it's been amazing, an incredible presentation. And you've enlightened us on a subject which is so important. And your research, wow, it's going to affect many lives. So we are extremely grateful to you. And Lal, I think we really must organize another, if you can, and if you can have your valuable time, and have another.
Maybe I could recommend a possible interesting, you know, I was saying that, you know, these Chabad rabbis really do a wonderful job training and taking care of autistic people. And most of them have, you know, zero college education and you know, maybe at most took high school biology, as opposed to you have a, you know, world-class education expert. What's the difference if someone with autism is saying like, send them to your local Chabad rabbi that's good at dealing with them, or are you going to give them some sort of like as a scientific expert? Does that mean you actually have good advice to like how a mother should deal with her autistic son?
Early intervention is key. That's my number one tip. Get early behavioral treatment.
But that's not your expert. I mean, so you're clinical, theoretical. You're not an expert in actually, you know, like dealing with autistic children.
Right,
or do you
but
do that
that's
also?
the data. I don't treat them. I just see them, and I mean not see them from the clinical perspective. I observe them. Let's put it this way.
So is it possible
data,
what I'm saying that
yeah.
uneducated, unscientific people are actually better at dealing with these people in terms of you know, like if you have an autistic child, like, you know, that you don't need a scientific education to know how to deal and treat them.
You know, mother knows best, but the data shows that getting early behavioral treatment, that is really the most important thing a mother could do.
Thanks for your time. I found your presentation very interesting. Really appreciate it. Hope to see you again.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me.
And really, it's been an honor and a privilege to have you. And we really thank you so much. We're very blessed to have had you tonight, really.
My pleasure. Thanks. Laila Tov.
Laila Tov, all the best.
Bye-bye.
Care.